Hey, all right, what's up? As you can see, we're doing something kind of unprecedented here. I'm taking another crack at a chapter that I'd already read. So I was, just reading this chapter, minding my own business, and I think I know what happened. I remember this happening at some point while I was recording videos that day, but I couldn't remember like when exactly. But I got a pop-up that said that my C drive, which is where I record videos to, is running out of space. And this has happened before, I just have to move all the videos I recorded to like the backup area to free up some space. So I did that like while I was recording. I thought while I was recording, but it turns out the recording at that point had just stopped already, and it sucks because this chapter is awesome, and I really did have a lot to say about it, and we kind of got into it. So we're gonna try again. I mean, it just doesn't feel right. I can't kind of recapture my initial reactions, but hopefully by reading through the chapter, I can kind of remember what I talked about, and I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what we get. So, all right. So the part we did read and talk about that actually got recorded is Kurosawa hanging out with the Americans, and I talked about how I thought it was so funny that the foreign minister is like barely in any of these shots, and then suddenly we cut to him and he's just like, I don't know, I don't know what to do. And we talked about global warming for a while. I went on quite a big rant against the various parties that would see us overlook our duty to restore the climate, to undo the damage we've already done. people in powers, People in positions of power that would like nothing more than us to just go on naively into our oblivion, selling and buying unsustainable energy sources and products and stuff. Yeah. We talked about all that. This is around where we got to before the recording cut out. So, yeah, we talked about this idea of the long game with natural resources that, and then I talked about did I talk about it? Well, I don't know if it got recorded or not. But I think I talked about my theory that eventually it seems like Canada will become the hegemon. That Canada, in its kind of unique position of having a whole lot of space, having even more space as global warming causes Arctic de-icing and more land kind of gets opened up and more trade routes and stuff, which is already a contentious issue between Canada and China, who owns the polar trade routes. And then Canada, of course, has tons and tons of oil that we've barely kind of scratched the surface of. Of course, it's not super easy oil to extract. You need to do some pretty environmentally devastating things to extract it from sand and stuff. It leads to there's a term for it. It's not what's it called? Whatever. And we've got tons and tons of natural drinking water, lots of trees, freshwater lakes, blah, 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 blah. This is my theory. Eventually, if things continue the way they have been, Canada will be put into some really weird position of power. But whatever, it doesn't matter. So on and so forth. It's not really relevant here. So Kurosawa changes teams again. I think that's so funny that he decides to go back with the monks. And then they start talking about the barrel again. I thought this was really cool. I kind of thought that arc was like over and done with. But we return to it now with like a different perspective, of course. Yeah, sure. And then yeah, this thing. I think this is really interesting when he talks about when the master priest chants prayers, it's not that different from being asleep. And I think here I talked about Siddhartha to some extent, contemplation and meditation and that kind of and I talked about how I could never pronounce this word properly. Ascetic. That sounds right. These ascetic rituals of deprivation and starvation and staying awake, staying motionless, can lead to extremely altered states Um, such that Mr. Gas and Mr. Gasoline's comments are, of course, totally off the mark. It's nothing easy like going to sleep, but it is something very different than being normally awake. And this is kind of the way that I thought about it up until this point. But then, of course, later in the chapter, we get Master Shonen's first-hand experiences. So then they leave, and I remember talking about how this seems like such an anticlimax to the arc, that in the end there wasn't really a huge confrontation, there wasn't some gigantic debate. But then I said, you know, this is very realistic, that when foreign dignitaries or types like this, special guests are visiting, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, whips up some big elaborate tour, and all of the people in those positions of the tour, when their role is done, it really is just kind of like this. They just leave, and that's it for their role in the reception, right? So yeah, they're checking out the super military helicopter thing, and their role is just kind of over. They decide to go by boat. Sure, sure. And then this is where the really interesting conversation happens. I really, really enjoyed this discussion, and at the time, I really feel bad that this wasn't recorded. Like, not to like, I don't really toot my own horn that often, I think. Like, I think most of the videos I make are around the same quality, you know? It's not that often that I finish doing, like, a manga reaction video, I'm like, ooh, that was a good one, or whatever. But I remember thinking after this one, like, oh, I'm really glad I got to talk about all that stuff. So, it sucks that it didn't get recorded. Um, I don't know. I don't know. So, Kurosawa brings up the barrel again. I remember talking a lot about. Oh, it's not yet. There's a later depiction of the barrel where Master Shonen is listening to the outside world that I thought was like a really good Kurosawa drawing, a really good kind of diagram type breakdown of what's happening. And I remember talking about how, yeah, all right, well, let's just get there. So he's like, he admits it. Like hell it does. It doesn't pass by in a flash at all. He just kind of said that to appease what the Americans wanted to hear. But truly, it's times you're able to stay focused, but that is not enough. Moments we become unbearably afraid because it's dark and cramped inside of the barrel. And because the barrel is buried underground. When that happens, I imagine what it looks like outside. This part I just loved. And the way that it shows kind of first this top-down perspective of the barrel, which is somehow much more isolating than the later 2D cutaway depiction of the barrel. This sort of three-dimensional one, I think, really shows the limits of his movement, shows his true entrapment by showing the entire, well, not the entire, but you know, like a significant portion of the circumference. Whoa, that word just didn't want to come out. The circumference of the barrel, and then we start zooming out of his buried barrel. It's true that I am underground, but if I listen carefully, I can hear around me the sound of people cleaning with bamboo brooms. Further, I can hear the chanting of sutras from inside the temple, and I can faintly hear the commotion in the city. I am not alone. Ooh, isn't that so lovely? And I was talking about how I used to do that at work to try to calm down. I would just really focus and listen to all the different office sounds, try to pick them out distinctly, try to kind of assume or extrapolate what action must be producing those sounds. And then out in the street, hearing the cars, the sound of traffic, the sound of the weather, if there is any. It's kind of nice. It's grounding. It's centering. You feel yourself amidst all of that. It's like there's this Pelvin book. Pelvin. I don't know. He's a Russian author that I quite like, called Buddha's little finger. And I haven't actually finished this one, but there's a part, I think it's like the opening epigraph of the book, where it talks about Genghis Khan caught in the whirlwind of just the situation in which he led himself. The hordes around him, the village people, the horses, the natural scenic beauty of the area he was conquering, and asking himself, like, where do I fit in among all of this? And of course, we're not Genghis Khan. And of course, the spot that we actually do fit in is much more tucked away. And yet, from our vantage point, it is a world that unfolds around us. So this is one thing to remember with self-compassion, which is something I talked a lot about in this when I was recording this chapter the first time. In the lost tape, and when it comes down to it, you're still within your own perspective. You're still immersed in the world, like where you are. I don't know how to put this very well. I am connected. I have a connection to this world. When I think that, I am able to calm down just a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. When I calm down, when I find calm in my soul, I focus on the things that I'm free to do in there. Yeah. This part I thought was really fun. He plays around with his fingers, his shoulder and his neck and his toes. I dance within the barrel. I twist and turn and relax. I am much freer than I thought. Above all, my mind is free. I can imagine anything I please. No one minds. Inside, I can jump around smiling. I am allowed to feel that happiness. It's up to me. And this, oh, this is so good. And I was so surprised and so impressed that in this moment, Kurosawa introspects all the way back to the first series, all the way back to his construction job, before the incident with the puppy misunderstanding, before the saga of homelessness, back when he really was confined in what was normal. Always felt like I was being limited. Even so, in my head, I'm free. I guess I was just relying on that freedom. Yeah, and this is so key to Kurosawa. This is what allows Kurosawa to, in those moments, land that legendary critical hit. It's what allows him to be the strongest man of all. That even though he was constrained within the circumstances of his life, he could imagine things beyond that. He was ready for the opportunities to transcend that because of that imagination. Life is a frame, yeah. I thought this was just so wonderful. Framed by how long you live, framed by customs, laws, and common sense. Also framed by your looks, intellect, and talent, framed by your social status and by what era you are living in. Essentially, it's the same as inside the barrel. Yeah, and this is the point I want to make with self-compassion. You can only be who you are. There's certain parts of you that are kind of immutable, that are just the frame you've been given. And when it comes down to it, you gotta think, like, despite all that, I'm doing pretty well for myself. You know? Despite all that, I still have a lot of freedom within me. Despite all that, I can enjoy that freedom that has been left to me. And that with that freedom, I'm actually doing pretty well. I think it's a really beautiful thing to realize. And as I said, this is a kind of a principal idea of self-compassion, as opposed to self-esteem. So for a long time, I explained this in the original recording too, so I feel like I need to explain it again. But this time it doesn't feel as motivated because I was like talking about other stuff in the original recording. This is so awkward. Why can't I just not screw up recording things? Okay, anyways, so so you have the idea of self-esteem, which I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with. And self-esteem is built on deriving value from your abilities and from your achievements and from what makes you kind of stand out from others. And this can, of course, be very powerful, very confidence-building, allowing you to take on much more than you would if you thought you were totally incapable, of course. So it's key, it's essential, but it can't be everything. because it's very fragile. If circumstances change, even entirely outside of your control, everything that you derive your self-esteem from can be lost. It has risks of turning you narcissistic or overly vain or an asshole. Like, you can't derive your entire self-worth just from your self-esteem. You also need a solid foundation of self-compassion. And the really eye-opening statement to me for self-compassion was that, like, if you had a friend, if you met someone, and you got to know them and you liked them and you enjoyed spending time with them and stuff, and they came to you with the problems that you're having, they came to you and opened up about all of the things that you personally struggle with, all of the framing circumstances of your life that limit what you're trying to do, that challenge it and are obstacles to overcome. You wouldn't say, like, well, come back to me when you're better. You wouldn't be like, we'll try a little harder then. First and foremost, you would just be compassionate. First and foremost, you would sympathize with this person and want to prove that your fondness for them is intangible, that it has nothing to do with any of these successes or failures or any of these perceived shortcomings or anything like that, right? Like, at least I think most people want to have that sort of unconditional support towards their friends. So it's like, well, why not do that for yourself? Why not treat yourself the way you would a friend in the same circumstances? That there really is a whole lot of your life that's out of your control. And not to suggest that people should have, like, a victim mentality, or that they should feel disempowered by this fact, but just that you should cut yourself some slack. All things considered, you're doing well. You know? I don't know. This to me is the message. If I was inside a barrel, if I think like that, I can come to terms with my own life. Yeah. Yeah. You know? We're all stuck in barrels. There's so much stuff that we just have to do that we don't want to do. There's so many things that were just chosen for us when we were born or even before that. There's so many things that just were genetic RNG that we had no control over whatsoever. And yeah, those things can be beneficial. Those things could actually line up perfectly with what you want. Or you can find them a living hell. And that's not your fault. That's just the lot you were dealt. This is just the hand you were dealt. The lot that was thrown. I mixed up my analogies there for a second. Mixing up gambling analogies or reading a Fukumoto series. That's one thing I can't be compassionate towards. That's a sin unforgivable. Anyways. That's the spirit, Master Kurosawa. It's wonderful. I like that Master Shonen here continues to call him Master Kurosawa, even though they don't have to maintain the ruse anymore. The Americans are long gone. I already know how to live comfortably within the barrel. Hell I do. Yeah, I like that, like, hell I do is kind of like the refrain of this chapter, that both Kurosawa and Shonen say it. Let me out of the barrel. Well, this is just it. And this, I think I went on a long tangent about revolutionary power and the fact that all the things that we think are kind of common sense facts about how society has to be are mostly just learned behavior imposed by the ruling political powers. We don't need to go over all of that again. But I think Kurosawa's analogous statement here of "let me out of the barrel," like, yeah, it's one thing to think I'm doing pretty well despite all the circumstances against me, but isn't it even better to just say, let's eliminate these harmful circumstances. Let's eliminate the things that limit people. Could you at least put me in a bigger one? Yeah. Stay diligent, you'll have a bigger barrel before you know it. And then this part, I forgot about this part. Oh my god, I'm really glad that I'm redoing this at least. Because I think that would really bug me if I didn't get to speak my mind on all of this stuff. It's a really wonderful chapter. Look, the moon is beautiful. It's more than enough, is it not? There's no need for fireworks. And this I think is maybe where I was talking about Siddhartha. Yeah, so if you don't know, Siddhartha, I'm not actually talking about the the legendary figure in real Buddhism. I'm talking about the book by Hermann Hesse, who is a German author, and not really a leading expert on the authenticity of various Buddhist schools of thought. It's not a book that you read to really understand real Buddhism. It's just a book that is very inspiring along those ways, and is a really good read, and is very interesting in and of itself. I'm just trying to make sure I make this clear. But anyway, so in the book Siddhartha, the titular Siddhartha achieves enlightenment, sitting by the banks of the river, just contemplating the river entirely in and of itself. And he had met earlier a ferryman who was doing this, who just spent all of his time outside of running the ferry, watching the river. And Siddhartha's like, meh. And then he goes and has all sorts of adventures. He lives very lavishly for a while. He lives very ascetically for a while, and does all sorts of deprivation rituals and stuff. And then, of course, he ends up coming back to the river. And I think this is a very common theme in a lot of sort of enlightenment-focused texts. Again, I don't want to make any statements about actual religion here, because that requires like a PhD. No, not a PhD, but it requires more than me just like rambling off based on a manga. It requires at least Wikipedia articles. But in these sort of religious adjacent fanfic type books or stories or whatever, this is a kind of a common theme of enlightenment, that it comes down to true recognition, appreciation of something simple, something natural, something that's been kind of there for you the whole time. And I think the moon is of course, a very stirring and wonderful example of that. That the moon is beautiful. It really is. The way it changes shape over days, the way it can illuminate clouds around it, the way it kind of plays off and counterpoints the trillions of stars dancing around it. Not that you can see trillions of stars. I don't know. Why am I being so pedantic with my own words? It's not like anyone who watches these videos is like a call-outer, you know? It's not that I actually anticipate any of my fans, like Rope Snake, making a comment like, actually, there's only however many visible stars. I was like, you got me. Anyways, yeah, the moon is beautiful. Is that not enough? And I don't know, maybe you can make some extended analogy of the Americans landing on the moon, Mr. Gasoline and Mr. Gas representing that sort of mindset that it is not enough. And then, of course, the fireworks were provided for them as well. They could have just looked at the moon. They could have just had a moon viewing and contemplation. But instead, yeah, it's a nice idea, though, isn't it? That you can trigger a deeper appreciation, one that transcends kind of any emotional state you've had up until now, just through contemplation of these everyday things. But what does Kurosawa think? I feel that way sometimes, but you know, I want them. I want that excitement. That thrill is vital. Life really does need fireworks. And I think this is the end of the chapter. Yeah. So, I don't know. A philosophical conversation, to be sure. One that still leaves many doors open for further contemplation. Well, what does it mean to be kind of satisfied with your life? What does it mean to be at peace with the world, with your circumstances? Is that the ultimate goal, or is it better to find interesting things? Is it better to explore the range of your emotions and find things to stir things you didn't even want from deep within yourself? I don't know. Maybe I knew when I recorded it the first time. Maybe at the end of the first recording I was like, don't worry, Master Shonen, Master Kurosawa, I have the answer right here. The secret to truly appreciating life while living peacefully within yourself and still having the full dynamicism of human emotion is... I don't know.